So we are heading to Lancashire today on the trail of an old creepy story. This one of the older videos, somebody commented on it. They told me, they said, Claire, have you heard of the Bannister Doll legend? Now, just to briefly summarise, it's a story that's local to the Preston area in Lancashire about a young girl who looked very, a bit like a doll. And she was tragically murdered by her father. And from this murder, there have been obviously ghost stories come out of it, but also strange legends as well that are really, really quite frightening. So that's what we're doing today. So this is a few months ago that the comment was on the video. So thank you if you're watching and you're the person that commented about the Bannister Doll story. So today we're finally in Preston and we're going to walk the streets where those legends sort of started from and see if we can uncover a little bit more about what's been going on here.
Long before motorways carved their way across Lancashire, before the bright lights of fast food restaurants and busy shopping streets, this was a county of dark moorland, smoking mill chimneys and crowded industrial towns. Lancashire helped power the Industrial Revolution. Cotton mills rose above the skyline, workers poured into expanding towns, and Preston itself grew at a staggering rate. Within a few decades, its population exploded from a small market town into a bustling industrial centre. But prosperity came at a cost. Behind the grand buildings and gaslit streets were crowded slums, disease, poverty and hardship. It was a world where reputations mattered, gossip travelled fast, and family scandals could ruin lives. And perhaps that's why stories like this took root so deeply here. Because Lancashire has never been short of dark tales. This is, after all, the county that gave us the infamous Pendle witch trials, a place where folklore, superstition and local legend have lingered for centuries. And among all those stories, few have burrowed their way into local memory, quite like the tale of the Bannister Doll. Nobody can quite agree on how the story began. Nobody can agree on exactly what happened. Yet generation after generation of Preston children grew up hearing the same warning. Some were told not to say her name aloud. Others claimed they heard her chains, and many were absolutely terrified of what might happen if she came looking for them after dark.
So we've decided to park at Trinity Square car park in Preston because this area serves as a pointer in our story. However, we're going to get back to that later so we don't get too confused in the narrative, so we will come back here. But yeah, so the Bannister Doll story, it's a very tragic tale. It's about a young girl who is found to be pregnant and the anger that her father shows towards her. That's how it all starts. So we're going to walk through the streets and we're going to find out more of the story and tell it as it comes along, and then learn about the legends, learn about the ghost stories and the things that have spiraled from that. So my name's Claire, this is the Wanderlust Way. Thanks to everybody that supports the channel. That's enough waffle, let's wander.
Of course, every town seems to have its own ghost story, the sort of story that's passed from one generation to the next until nobody can quite remember where it started. A story that grandparents tell their children, older brothers tell younger sisters, and school children whisper to each other when the teachers aren't listening. And here in Preston, I'm told that story is the Bannister Doll. Now, what I found fascinating while researching this episode was just how many people remember it. Not from books, not from websites, but from their childhood. Some remembered being told that saying her name 3 times would summon her spirit. Others claimed she haunted the staircases and banisters. One person recalled being warned that if they didn't get into bed and stay under the covers, the Bannister Doll would come looking for them. Another remembered hearing the faint rattle of her chains. The details change depending on who is telling the story. Sometimes she's a ghost, sometimes she's a doll, sometimes she's a warning. But whatever version people grew up with, one thing remains remarkably consistent: the fear. And perhaps that's why the story has survived for so long, because unlike many local legends, the Bannister Doll wasn't simply a tale about a ghost girl. It was so much more than that, because it has roots in what was meant to be a true story. The story goes that long ago there was a young girl by the name of Dorothy Bannister, aka Dolly for short. Now she found herself pregnant, and when her father found out about this, he decided the only thing he should do, she'd brought shame on him, shame on the family, so the best thing to do was to punish her. According to local tradition, Dorothy Bannister was one of the most beautiful young women in Preston. Some versions of the story claim her looks earned her the nickname the Bannister Doll, a name that would survive long after she was gone. Whether that nickname was genuinely used during her lifetime is difficult to prove, but it has become firmly attached to the legend ever since. And if we are to believe the story, these are the very streets Dolly would have known. The streets she walked, the streets where neighbours exchanged gossip over backyard walls, the streets where news travelled quickly and secrets rarely stayed secret for long. Then came the news that would change everything. According to the most commonly repeated version of the tale, Dolly became pregnant outside of marriage. Exactly who the father was depends on which version of the story you hear, and as we'll discover later, there are many different versions. What most versions do agree upon is that when word reached Dolly's father, his reaction would become the most infamous part of the entire legend. This building that is behind me was once St Wilfrid's School. Now it's no longer a school, but in its day this is probably where some of the rumours of the stories, how the legend would have spread. Now I've read some stories from people that attended this school, and they remember clearly the story of the Bannister Doll. Some of them suggested that there was a tale that if you knocked on the banister 3 times she would appear at the back staircase. Now there's legends like this in all of our towns and cities, and if you're from somewhere other than Preston, feel free to share yours. But if you are from Preston, or if you went to this school or a school in the area, do let us know if you remember the Bannister Doll tales and what you remember from that time. St Wilfrid's School first opened its doors in 1814 and for generations educated children in the heart of Preston. In fact, it was here in 1816 that one of the first public demonstrations of gaslighting in England took place, making the school something of a local pioneer at a time when much of the country was still lit by candles and oil lamps. One of the oldest surviving school buildings in Lancashire, this Grade 2 listed structure remained in educational use for around 2 centuries, before eventually closing as a school in the 21st century. Now, there are plenty of schools in Preston, but this one kept appearing during my research. Again and again I came across people who remembered hearing stories about the Bannister Doll here as children, not from books or ghost tours, but from other pupils. Now some remembered being told that if you stood on a particular stair and said her name 3 times, her ghost would appear. Others recalled tales of a mysterious figure on the back staircase, and more than a few admitted that, as children, they were genuinely terrified by the story. What's fascinating is that many of those memories come from the late 20th century, nearly 200 years after Dolly is supposed to have lived. Children were still frightening each other with stories about her. Think about that for a moment. Generations of pupils passed through these corridors, teachers came and went, Preston changed around them, yet somehow the legend endured. The Bannister Doll had become part of the school itself, and perhaps that's how the best ghost stories survive, not because they're written down, but because somebody whispers them to the next generation. One of the core subjects of this story is shame, and it revolves around the fact that Mr. John Bannister, he was supposed to be quite high up in local government, so when he found out that his unmarried daughter Dorothy was pregnant, it obviously was not a good thing. He was worried about his reputation, he was worried about how it would look to other people in the area, and that's what started this all rolling really, the shame of it all. It's easy to look back on stories like this from a modern perspective and wonder how anyone could react in such a brutal way. But we have to remember that we are stepping into a very different world. In the Preston of the early 19th century, reputation wasn't simply a matter of pride. It could shape your future, your livelihood, your standing in the community, and even the prospects of your family. People did talk, neighbours did watch, and once gossip took hold, it could be almost impossible to escape. According to the legend, Dolly's pregnancy quickly became the talk of the town. Whether that really happened or not, the fear of public humiliation would certainly have been real enough. Imagine walking these streets knowing that every glance, every whisper and every conversation might be about you. Imagine feeling that your family name has become a source of scandal. And then imagine what might happen if somebody became consumed by that shame. Because if the story is to be believed, it wasn't a ghost story that people feared. It was a father. And what he was about to do would leave a mark on Preston that some believe can still be felt today. Just a short walk from the school you can find St Wilfrid's Church, which I've brought you to because this would have been here when the story was being passed down through the children at the school, because it was built a long time ago and it still stands. Now, I've never been to Preston before, so this is the first time I've seen it, but from the photographs that I've seen online of how it used to look, like all the towns and cities in the UK, things have changed quite dramatically. So there's very few buildings still standing that were there before, and obviously this church is not only still standing, but it is still remaining for its original purpose, which is as a church. Now, there were two strange stories that I found when I was looking into this church. The first one was that some of the graves from the church were actually paved over and they made a schoolyard, a playground. So that's an unusual one. I imagine if that's true, and if you're from Preston and you know that's true, then I imagine that would have only fueled more children's tales. You know, this is our playground and we're walking on a graveyard. And the second story, which I thought was a bit unusual, was that there are meant to be secret tunnels underneath this church which lead to various other buildings in the city. So yeah, I don't know, again, if you're from Preston you will know more than me, so feel free to share what you know in the comments. Just a short walk from St Wilfrid's School stands St Wilfrid's Church. Built in 1793 and still serving its original purpose today, it is one of the oldest surviving buildings in this part of Preston. Generations of local people have passed through its doors, and for generations more, children will have made the short journey between the church and the nearby school. It's not difficult to imagine those same children walking these streets decades ago, some heading home after lessons, some daring each other to say the Bannister Doll's name, some repeating stories they had heard from older brothers, sisters, parents and grandparents. Because that's the thing about legends like this, they don't stay in one place. They drift through the neighbourhood, they travel along the streets, they pass from person to person until eventually nobody can remember where they first heard them. Somewhere between the church, the school and the surrounding streets, the story of Dolly Bannister found a new generation of listeners. And perhaps that shouldn't be surprising because, according to some versions of the legend, Dolly's death wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. In the years that followed, strange tales began circulating through Preston. Stories of sightings, stories of hauntings, and stories of violent deaths that some locals believed could somehow be connected to the young woman whose name they still whispered after dark. Whether any of that was true is another question entirely. But before we get to the ghost story, we first need to understand what happened to Dolly. So what did Mr Bannister do when he found out about Dolly being pregnant? Well, the story goes that, well, there's two versions of the story actually, and this is how legends can split sometimes. So one of the legends suggests that she was dragged by horse and cart through the town, and she was brought to this sort of area, which is Ladywell Street, and she was tied to a rock and he publicly beat her. Now, he beat her so bad that the rumours are that her blood made the street run red. There's other stories that he didn't, but the predominance of the story is that he beat her, whipped her, which was allowed in those days. A father could do that if he was disappointed with his daughter. So that happened around this area. Now I've heard, and if you're from Preston and you know for sure, then do let us know, that around this area there used to be a boulder that used to mark the place where this whipping took place. And it was said that parents and grandparents would bring their children to the spot to show them what would happen if they were naughty or they disobeyed their parents.
Now, public punishment was not unusual in 19th century Britain. It was a world where authority was rarely questioned, discipline could be severe, and the line between maintaining order and outright abuse was often far less clear than it is today. But if the legend is true, what happened to Dolly went far beyond a father trying to teach his daughter a lesson. Imagine the scene: a frightened young woman dragged into the street by the very man who was supposed to protect her. Neighbours watching from doorways and windows, whispers spreading from one end of Preston to the other, the crack of the whip echoing between the buildings, the sting of leather against skin, the humiliation and the fear, the knowledge that there was nowhere to run, and perhaps most chilling of all, the possibility that nobody stepped forward to stop this. Whether the people of Preston pitied Dolly, condemned her, or simply looked the other way is impossible to know, but according to the legend, they remembered, and as the years passed, the story grew darker. Some claimed that on stormy nights the wind carried more than rain through these streets, that if you listened carefully enough, you could still hear faint sobs drifting through the darkness, the cries of a young woman whose suffering had become woven into the fabric of the town itself. A ghost story, perhaps, or simply a community trying to make sense of something too terrible to forget.
Now this brings us to an area called Snow Hill, as you've just seen on the sign, and this is supposedly where the Bannister family lived. Now again, the legend splits. Some people say they lived here, some people say they lived in Bannister Hall, which I will take you to at the very end of this video. But if we go by the thoughts that this is where the home was, Dorothy, or Dolly, was brought here after that whipping, and sadly she did die from her injuries. Now this is also an area where some of the ghost sightings have been seen. People have reported a strange, obviously ghostly like figure of a young girl, looks a bit like a doll because they said her face was so pure it was like porcelain, and she's been seen up and down this street, often covered in blood. There are other darker tales to the story as well.
It took me less than 10 minutes to walk from the spot where Dolly was said to have been beaten to her home here on Snow Hill. Back then, of course, it would have looked very different. The cottages, the streets and the people who lived here have long since disappeared. But standing here, it's difficult not to think about that final journey. Because if the legend's true, Dolly wouldn't have walked home. She couldn't have. According to the story, she would have been carried back here after the punishment inflicted by her father. A frightened young woman whose life had been torn apart in front of her neighbours. According to local tradition, Dolly Bannister was taken back home, but the next time she emerged, it was in a coffin. And for most stories that would be where things end, but not this one. Because over the years people began claiming that although her father had destroyed her life, he had failed to destroy her spirit, and that's where the story takes a darker turn. Was Dolly destined to become one of Preston's tragic ghosts, a sorrowful figure said to wander the streets where she suffered, her cries sometimes carried on the wind as a reminder of what had happened to her? Or did something else happen? Did the story gradually transform her into something far more sinister? A spirit consumed by anger and a desire for revenge? Because depending on who you ask, the ghost of Dolly Bannister returned to Preston for very different reasons. Legends often work a little bit like Chinese whispers, and this is why we see so many different variations of the story, especially as it is a very old one as well. So the more people that are telling it, the more detail gets added and so forth. But one of the saddest details to come up from this story is that after Dolly died, somebody approached her father and said the story wasn't as simple as he first thought, and in fact Dolly was completely innocent. There is one version of this story that not only breaks hearts, but strikes fear too. It is the version that Dolly wasn't carrying the child of a secret boyfriend at all, that she was in fact the victim of a terrible crime. Some accounts claim that Dolly had been attacked by 3 local men and that her pregnancy was the result of that assault. If true, this changes everything. Suddenly it's not a story about a young woman bringing shame upon her family. It's a story about a young woman who suffered a terrible injustice and was then punished for something that was never her fault in the first place. And perhaps that's why some of the darker versions of the legend took shape, because if Dolly was innocent, then her ghost becomes something very different. No longer a tragic figure wandering the streets where she suffered, but a wronged spirit, a spirit with unfinished business. And according to the stories that followed, the 3 men responsible would soon discover that Dolly Bannister was not done with them yet. Everything I've told you about this story, it comes from either local legend or some historical reports, because there was indeed a family known as Bannister. They were very prominent in this area. It was a popular name, and there was a John Bannister as well. He was actually high up in the House of Correction, I believe. Now there's going to be people watching this video that have probably know more about the story, especially if you are born and bred in Preston. So I can't possibly know everything that you guys know. So if you do, again, please share the comments, and I'd love to know a little bit more about this legend and about this. There's several different variations of the ghost story. Now, one is that Dolly appears as she seems like a pretty little doll with a pale face. She just appears, she's bleeding. It's more of a sad tale. It's a tale of a warning, really, about what had happened to her. But then there is another tale, another ghost story that is far darker and far more sinister. And the stories around that stem from the moment after Dolly died. What happened after that? In the years that followed her death, strange stories began circulating around Preston. The first concerned 3 young men. According to one of the darker versions of the tale, the men believed to have attacked Dolly met violent and mysterious ends. One was found dead in the centre of town, then another, then a third. Their injuries were said to have been so severe that people struggled to explain what had actually happened to them. Before long, rumours were spreading through Preston. Had somebody taken revenge? Or had Dolly Bannister returned from the grave to settle the score herself? The mysterious deaths eventually stopped, but the stories did not. People claimed to see the ghost of a young woman drifting through the streets around Snow Hill. Some described her as wearing a pale bonnet. Others said she seemed to float silently through the darkness before vanishing without a trace. And then there was the house. According to local legend, after Mr. Bannister died, new families moved into the property where Dolly had once lived. Yet time and time again the same stories emerged: strange sightings, unexplained disturbances, a feeling that somebody or something was still there. One family reportedly left after only a couple of nights. The next did little better. And with every retelling, the legend grew darker. By the 20th century, children were daring each other to say her name aloud. Some whispered rhymes, others refused to walk certain staircases alone. Amongst children, stories circulated that if you called upon the Bannister Doll, she would appear at the top of the stairs, her hand resting on the banister as she watched from the shadows. Perhaps she was a warning, or perhaps she was a victim. Or perhaps, in the minds of a generation of Preston children, she had become something far more frightening. I said at the beginning that we would return to Holy Trinity Square car park, and that's exactly what we're doing now. So you can see behind me that this obviously used to be a church, and this is the church and the churchyard that Dolly was meant to be buried in. Now, I couldn't find any historical records to prove that, but that's not to suggest that it didn't happen, because in those days historical records didn't always take place. They didn't always happen like they do today. But I think just seeing this here, this old part in the middle of a new car park, it just a haunting reminder of how fast our towns and cities again have changed. But despite the fact that all that's changed, the story of Dolly is still lingering in certain places. For many years, Holy Trinity Church stood here at the heart of Preston. Built in the 1800s, it served generations of local families before eventually being demolished in the 1950s. Today, little remains to suggest this once was a place of worship. Cars come and go, people hurry about their day. And yet, for those families familiar with the legend, this ordinary patch of ground occupies a rather extraordinary place in the story. The church stood only a short distance from Snow Hill, close enough that if the events of the legend unfolded as people claimed, Dolly's final journey would have been a very short one indeed. It's a sobering thought. A young woman whose life was supposedly cut short just around the corner, laid to rest within sight of the streets where her story played out. Of course, Preston has changed beyond recognition since then. The church has gone, it's now a car park. The cottages have been knocked down and replaced with modern dwellings. The people who first whispered about this story are no longer here either. And yet somehow the story still remains. Perhaps that's because legends have a habit of lingering long after the places that gave birth to them have disappeared. Or perhaps it's because some people still believe that Dolly never truly left these streets behind, even now, more than 2 centuries later. So there's 2 versions of the Bannister Doll story, and like I said earlier on, the legend sort of splits multiple times. And one of the stories that I'd read online is that Dolly and Mr. John Bannister actually lived in a place called Bannister Hall, which is supposed to be, or was, down this road somewhere. Now, Bannister Hall has long been demolished. However, we're still going to go and have a little look, because I just think it would complete this story nicely. It's a very isolated track, but I think there's a landscape company down here somewhere, and they go by the name of Bannister Hall Landscapes, so that's what we're looking out for. There we are. So that would make sense. So I can understand why people would assume that Dorothy Bannister lived at Bannister Hall, because of obviously the name. Now, whether that's true or not, I do not know, because again, this is a legend. This is stories that have passed down multiple times through different people. But yeah, really interesting to come up here and see this. So that is it. Thank you to everybody for joining me on this week's Wander, looking for the Preston and Bannister Doll story. And again, if you know any more, if I've missed anything out, then please do let me know in the comments. Right then, so next week I'm staying in Lancashire, and I'm going to be visiting one of the country's most historic and famously haunted houses, and that is of course Salemsbury Hall, which is behind me. So if you want to stick around, that'll be going live next week, next Sunday. So until then, stay safe, stay curious, and don't have nightmares.